Good morning, everyone. It is great to see those of you that are here. I know it's been mentioned a couple times already. We've got a lot of folks that are sick. And I know that we also have people worshiping with us online, so we want to welcome you. We're grateful for your presence as well. We want to thank our visitors for being with us. It's always good to have visitors, and we're grateful for your presence. All right, before we begin, I have to make my first public correction to a mistake, and I made it 3 weeks, which is actually pretty good for me. So my first week here, I introduced myself and our family, and when I'm thinking family, I was thinking people that live under my roof at this moment. So I introduced, obviously, my wife Susan, and I introduced Carly and Kinsey, but I have been properly chastised that I have left out a couple more of our children. We have 4, for those of you that didn't know. We have 4 girls. Our oldest daughter, some of you, many of you, have already met her and her husband. Her name is Sydney. Her last name is McClure. She's sitting right there with her husband, Houston. I joked I was going to make them stand up, and she threatened to walk out. So I can't do that. But Houston and Sydney, she's our oldest daughter, and he's obviously our son-in-law, and he is a part of our family. And then I have one other daughter, Susan and I do. Her name is Ashley. She is a junior at college. Ashley, if you're watching, I love you too, honey. She will be home actually the middle of December, so you'll get to meet her. She's going to spend a couple of months with us before her next semester will start. So, all right, have I done it, honey? Have I properly introduced? Okay, all right. I got the thumbs up from the boss, so I am good to go. I want to start this morning by posing a question to you. Why are you here? That may seem like a little bit of an odd question, but I want you to think about it with me for just a moment. Why are you here? And I mean, at first glance, maybe we think, well, it's Sunday. It's the first day of the week. I mean, obviously, we're supposed to be here. We're here to worship. We're here to be together. But I want you to really think a little bit deeper and consider, why are you here? And maybe the better question is, why are we Christians? Why do we serve? Why do you and I do what we do? Simon Sinek is a British-American author, and I actually mentioned him in Tony's Bible class on Sunday morning a couple of weeks ago. He's written a book that's titled Start With Why. And it's a secular book. It's directed specifically at businesses. And the premise of the book focuses on what he calls the golden circle. And it's a circle, and it has 3 layers to this circle. The outer layer of the circle focuses on what? So if you think from a business perspective, it would be what goods or services does a company offer to a community or to society. So let's say a business sells shirts. Well, the what would be shirts. That's the commodity that they are selling to society. The next layer, kind of the middle layer, is the how. How do they sell those shirts? Do they have independent stores that they own and they sell the shirts in those stores? Or do they contract with other retail spaces and sell through that space? How do they market? Do they market directly to consumers, or do they do some other type of marketing? Do they focus on television advertisements, or maybe entirely through the internet and social media? But the inner circle is what Simon Sinek would say is the most important part, but it's also the most overlooked. And the inner circle is the why. Why? Why do they even sell shirts to begin with? And Sinek's premise is this, that most companies don't even know the why. They start from the outer circle and work their way in instead of starting from the inner part and working their way out. And as I read that part of the book and thought about that, I thought there is an incredible spiritual application there, isn't there? You think about the what. What are we doing this morning? Well, we're gathered together as a group of God's people to worship. How are we doing that? Well, we're singing. We've gathered around the Lord's table. We pray. We study Scripture. But why? Why are you and I here? Why do we do what we do? And that's the question I would like for us to consider this morning, because you see, typically what I have found in my experiences in growing up in the church is we're kind of guilty of that same thing. We start from the outside and work our way in, don't we? We decide what we want to do. So for example, maybe we want to spend more time together fellowshipping. Well, then we go to the how, and what we'll do is we'll create a great program that'll do that. But we've never really understood the why. And as a result, it might start with a bang and then just fizzle over time, doesn't it? But you see, if we get the why right, that changes everything. Because now we've got the right motivation and everything else just kind of comes naturally after that. Open your Bibles with me this morning to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I want us to consider together some things that I believe can influence our why. Can influence us in a way that if we can get better at understanding some of these things, maybe it starts to transform us individually as people from the inside out. And then some of those things that we desire to do as a result of being Christians and servants and disciples of Christ just become a natural part of our life. The first thing that I believe can influence our why is our view of life. I want you to consider two things about Paul's perspective about life, and it really starts with understanding the position he's in as he's writing the book of 2 Corinthians. If you and I were to go back and look at Paul's life, what we would find is this is one of the most difficult periods of his life. It's one of the darkest moments in his life, physically, emotionally, and I believe maybe even spiritually. You see, Paul finds himself dealing even with physical illness. So physically, his body is struggling. He's succumbing to just the normal aspects of living a human life, and he's physically ill. Emotionally, he finds himself in a really difficult position. You see, he's left Ephesus and he's traveling, and he was going to meet up with Titus, one of his best friends, you might say, one of his mentees, as he's been a mentor to him. And Titus is going to bring a report about the church in Corinth to him. And they get to the place where they're going to meet, and Titus doesn't show up. He's not there. And that causes emotional distress for Paul because he wants to know, how is the church in Corinth? And more importantly, is Titus okay? Has something happened to him? And as this is going on, in addition to that, there are struggles in other churches that Paul has helped to establish that are just weighing on him from a spiritual standpoint. And as a result, if we were to read this entire book, we would find that Paul is struggling at this point in his life. And all these pressures are on him. And I want you to notice some things that Paul mentions here in the opening chapters of 2 Corinthians that give us some insight into his perspective of life. Start in chapter 3 with me, and let's just look at one verse, verse number 6. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. You see, Paul's having to defend his apostleship. What's happening in the church of Corinth is there are Jewish Christians that are somehow trying to diminish Paul as an apostle and the message that Paul's preaching, because they're trying to bind on Christians Jewish traditions that have no business being a part of Christianity. And it's the point that even Peter has fallen victim to this line of thinking. And Paul is now having to defend himself to this group of people that are a part of the church in Corinth. And part of what he says is, look, we are ministers of a new covenant. The message that we're preaching has nothing to do with the Jewish law. In fact, if we were to continue reading verse 6, he says, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And we understand that in the context because Paul is trying to tell them that some of these things that are part of Jewish tradition that these Jewish Christians may want to bind on you, that's not part of this new message, the new covenant that Jesus has established that I'm preaching to you. But then notice what he says in verse 4. How does he have this ministry? How is he able, chapter 4 and verse 1, how is he able to proclaim this? Chapter 4 and verse 1 says this, therefore, having this ministry, the ministry of the new covenant, how? By the mercy of God. The whole reason that Paul's able to have this ministry is entirely by God's mercy. And he says it's because of God's mercy, then we don't lose heart. But now drop down to verse 7 of chapter 4. But we have this treasure. What's the treasure? It's the message. It's the message of this new covenant. We've got this treasure how? In jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Now we're starting to see the change in Paul's perspective. You see, Paul recognizes that he's got this ministry. It's the ministry of the new covenant. It's made entirely possible by God's mercy, and yet he uses this weak physical body, even like Paul's, to somehow proclaim this incredible treasure that is this new covenant. Notice what he says in chapter 4 and verse 8. He says, we're afflicted in every way but not crushed, perplexed but not driven to despair, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed. You see, it doesn't matter what happens physically to Paul anymore. It doesn't matter whether he's suffering physical ailment. It doesn't matter whether he's being persecuted. It doesn't matter what type of circumstance Paul finds himself in, because now it's not about his physical power. It's about the power that resides entirely in God. And now notice chapter 5 and verse 1. For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. You see, this is the heart of Paul's change in perspective. Paul no longer views life from a physical perspective. Paul's focus is entirely eternal. And he gives this comparison between a tent and a permanent dwelling. And the tent is this physical body that he resides in. Think about Jesus. The Gospel of John. John chapter 1 and verse 1, maybe one of the more famous verses in all the Gospels. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then we think about verse 14, that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That word dwelt, it means to tabernacle or to tent. Literally, the Word, Jesus, became flesh. He became, just like you and me, He tented, He tabernacled, He dwelt here for just a moment of time, because the flesh is temporary. And Paul brings that perspective back to life. Think about all the examples with me in the Old Testament of temporary versus permanent. Think about the children of Israel. As they entered the promised land for the very first time, they had been a nomadic people living in tents. But now, all of a sudden, they were going to live in permanent houses. You think about the tabernacle, literally a tent that was replaced by the temple, a permanent dwelling. But then you think about all of the old law, the temple, the priesthood. Every aspect of it was temporary, pointing to the permanent, which was Jesus. And here Paul says, the physical, the body, it's just temporary. Because what really matters is the eternal, this house, this building from God. It's already made. It's already done. It's the place of God's presence that is ultimately the most important to Paul as he looks about the life that he's living, and he considers the circumstances that he finds himself in. And I love verse number 5. He says, it has been given all these promises, this building that's prepared for us, this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. That word guarantee, it's a neat word. It means a down payment. In essence, he's saying that this down payment that serves as a legal claim to the very thing that Paul is talking about has been given to us in the form of the Spirit. You see, the eternal view is what really matters. It's having this proper view of life. And so then we pick up in verse 6 of chapter 5. So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we're away from the Lord. All right, we have to live like this for a period of time. God has created the world. He's made mankind. He's given us this body, so we know that we're away from the Lord while we're in this body, and we've got to live this way, for we walk by faith, not by sight. You see, you and I can't view God's house, can we? We can't view eternity. We can't view heaven. In fact, every aspect of our lives is in many ways defined by time, isn't it? So our ability to fully grasp this idea of dwelling in God's presence fully and for eternity is really hard to comprehend. But yet we walk then by faith because we can't see that. But what we can see is the evidence that God has given us, that He's real, that He fulfills His promises, that He's true to everything that He says, because we can look back at the record that we have that shows God's promises are true. So we walk by faith, not by sight, and because of all this, we are of good courage. And we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please Him. I like that. Doesn't matter where we find ourselves. As we live here on this earth, we make it our aim. We aspire. It is our ambition in every way to please Him. To look at Him and see Him and try to the best of our ability then to please Him. Why? Verse 10 tells us, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil." You see, Paul understood his why was motivated by his view of life. It was influenced by his view of life. He knew that this physical body, that the physical things that he was experiencing were only temporary, that what really mattered was being in God's presence. And so as he lived, his aim and his desire was to please God, because he knew at some point, when all this ends, that he would be before the judgment seat of Christ. And he would give an account on how he had lived in striving to aim or please or be like Christ. So you think about us as we gather here this morning. Why are we here? Why do we do what we do as Christians? Why do we serve? Why do we want to be a part of a church family? I believe our why needs to be influenced by our view of life. It's hard sometimes, though, isn't it? Satan's constantly tugging at us and pulling at us, wanting us to think about the physical things that are around us. It's hard not to be caught up in the pressures of our jobs or of school or of just our community and the ways that those pressures can push around us. And we have obligations while we live here on this earth that God expects us to fulfill. But as we fulfill them, our view has to be an eternal one. We have to remember that what we experience here is temporary. And we will ultimately give an account one day before Christ. And our desire is to be in God's presence, to dwell with Him in His presence eternally. So one thing that influences our why is just our view of life. But the second thing that I believe Paul says that influences his why is the view of the cross. Let's pick back up in verse 11 of chapter 5. "Therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade others. But what we are is known to God, and I hope it is known also to your conscience. We are not commending ourselves to you again, but giving you cause to boast about us, so that you may be able to answer those who boast about outward appearance and not about what is in the heart." So let's just pause before we go to verse 13, and let's explain these couple of verses, and then we'll talk about verse 13 as well. In essence, what Paul is trying to say is this: I want you to be confident in what you have heard about us and in my apostleship. We don't boast in outward appearance. It's not about Jewish tradition or Jewish rites. It's about the message that I have proclaimed. And I'm commending myself to you again. I'm defending my apostleship so that you can have confidence. You can have confidence in what you've heard. Verse 13, "For if we are beside ourselves, it is for God. If we are in our right mind, it is for you." If those on the outside looking in, or if those that are making the false accusations against Paul think he's out of his mind by not somehow enforcing these Jewish regulations, Paul is saying that my message is for God, because my message is about His message. It's a message that's open to all. But he says, if we're in our right mind, it's for you. If what I'm saying is true, in essence, Paul is saying, then you benefit from that, because I'm giving you the truth in the gospel. But then notice what he says in verse 14. This is the important part. "For the love of Christ controls us, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. And He died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for Him who for their sake died and was raised." You see, for Paul, it was about the cross. Paul's view of his why that motivated him to continue on was influenced entirely by the cross, because Paul understood that the cross represented a substitutionary death. That Paul was the one that should have been on that cross. That you and I are the ones that deserved that cross. Put a marker here, and we'll come back, and turn to Romans chapter 5 with me. I want you to read together with me Romans chapter 5, beginning in verse number 6. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. So here Paul's talking about what earthly love looks like. Earthly love says, you know what, maybe for a good person, I might be willing to give up my life. Maybe. But God shows His love for us, verse number 8, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Here's God's love compared to earthly love. When we deserved it the least, when we were at our very worst, that's when God's love was extended, that Christ died for us. Since therefore we've now been justified by His blood, much more shall we be saved by Him from the wrath of God. I want you to think about this idea of being justified. Maybe you've heard this used before, this idea of being justified and what it means. That it kind of stands for just if I'd never sinned. Justified, just if I'd never sinned. But the word itself is a fascinating word. It's actually a legal term. So the idea is this: it's standing before a judge in a legal setting and being given the idea of that you are not guilty. You do not have to pay the punishment for this crime. So you think about being justified before God. You and I have the ability, because of the cross, to stand before God, and we don't have to receive the guilty verdict that we deserve because of sin. Why? Well, Paul tells us because of the cross, because of the blood of Jesus. That's what's justified us. Verse number 10. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son, much more now that we are reconciled shall we be saved by His life. So the first term was justified. The second term is reconciled. Reconciled has to do with friendship. Paul defines it for us. He says, if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God. We've been made friends again. That's an incredible picture that Paul paints. And it's all because of the cross. And it's because Jesus took our place. Now go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. It's all because Christ took the punishment that you and I deserved. And that death is what allows us to live. He says, He died for all, verse number 15, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for Him who for their sake died and was raised. It's hard in my mind not to remember Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20 when I think about that verse. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I that live, but Christ in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. You see, it's about allowing the cross to put to death that old person so that we can now live as a new person, a new creature. Something completely different. And our life is now devoted to, influenced by, motivated by, driven by, entirely by Christ. So you think about our why. Why are we here? Why do we serve? Why are we Christians? Well, in part, our why is influenced by our view of eternity, recognizing that there's more than just the physical part of life, but it's motivated by the cross and the love of Christ. Because as we look at the cross, what we see Christ taking our place. And now everything changes because we recognize what we deserve. But because of Christ, we don't have to receive that guilty verdict. We can be found not guilty. And we no longer have to be separated from God. There no longer has to be this barrier of sin that it separates us from God and His presence. We now are made friends again with God. And we have access to Him. And now, all of a sudden, when that starts to motivate our why, things start to flow a little more naturally. But then ultimately, our third piece here is our why is influenced. Paul's why was influenced by his view of others. Look at verse number 16 of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard Him thus no longer. And I want to start with the second half of that verse and understand what Paul's trying to communicate. He says, we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard Him thus no longer. Paul's life is really distinctly defined by a moment in time, isn't it? And there's two sides to Paul's life. It's almost like two sides to a coin. Paul's life is clearly defined by his experience on the road to Damascus. As he was on the road to Damascus to go persecute other Christians, prior to the moment that Christ presented Himself to him, what was Paul's view of Christ? His view was that He was a false Christ, wasn't it? He was a false Messiah. He didn't believe that Christ truly was the Christ. So you see, in essence, what Paul is saying here is, I once regarded Christ according to the flesh. I once thought of Him strictly from a fleshly perspective. My view was inaccurate. I viewed Him as a false Christ, but now I no longer regard Him that way. I see Him for who He really is. And because of that, it's changed my view of people, in essence, Paul is saying. Boy, when I think of the Apostle Paul, I don't know if there's anyone that has ever lived that was able to look at people and only see souls. I don't know if anybody did it as well as Paul did. When you and I look out and we see people, what do we see? You know, society defines us in many different ways, doesn't it? We're defined by our gender, we're defined by our ethnicity, we're defined by our socioeconomic status, we're defined by our educational status. There are any number of things that can define us. If you and I were to I've got to go get my driver's license here soon, and I'm sure as a part of that paperwork, I'm going to have to fill out certain things. They want to know questions about you, don't they? They want to know your ethnicity and your gender and all these different things. And it's easy as we look at people to see those things too, isn't it? And as we see those things, it's hard sometimes not to get caught up in making judgments about people, isn't it? Where we see people and we may not even intentionally judge them in a way that we think they're unworthy maybe of the gospel, or maybe they've done something that causes them to somehow deserve the circumstances they're in, or any number of things. And those things may be true to some degree, but Paul says that's not how you look at life. That's not how you see people. And I think when the Apostle Paul looked, he didn't see gender. He didn't see socioeconomic status. He didn't see ethnicity. He saw souls. He saw souls that either needed the message of Jesus initially, or he saw souls that needed to be encouraged and strengthened, or he saw souls that might sometimes need to be corrected. But when he saw people, he saw souls. And that fundamentally changed his why. And when you and I think about our why, how do we view people? What do we see? You see, the more that we can work towards seeing souls, the more our why starts to change. Because now we serve because we see souls that need the message of Jesus, because there is an eternal view to life, that everyone that ever lived will one day stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And the only thing that can make a difference in our lives and in other people's lives is the cross. And now our why starts to take shape. And why we're here this morning starts to become more clear. And why we choose to serve in the ways that we serve or be a part of God's family start to change, because our why starts to change. And I believe when we look at this passage, what we see beginning in verse 1, this change in perspective for Paul. He had an eternal view. And then we see a change in what motivates him or compels him. And he was compelled by the cross and by Christ. And that led him to just think souls. To think about souls that needed that incredible message. And it fundamentally changed his perspective about how others viewed him, about how he lived his life, about what he would be willing to suffer and live with and deal with, because he knew that all that mattered when it was said and done was Christ and the cross and his relationship with Christ and what he had done to make a difference in the lives of other people through that message. You think about our why. Truthfully, our why might be a little different for all of us, but ultimately, it needs to be motivated by our view of eternity, our view of the cross, and how we see people. As you think about your why this morning, I hope you'll consider some of those points together. I hope that all of us will think about, why are we here? Why are we a body of God's people? And what is our purpose in serving this community? And I hope we'll allow these things to motivate us as we strive to serve Christ together. In just a moment, we're going to stand. We're here this morning as a family. And I know that anytime we come together as a family, there's a strong possibility that there are people here this morning that might be hurting in some way. Maybe spiritually, maybe emotionally, maybe physically. And this is a great time for us to come together as a family of God's people to pray for one another, to encourage each other, to serve each other in any way that we can. If you're here this morning and you need the strength and encouragement of your church family, if we can help you in any way, whether that's putting on Christ in baptism or just encouraging you in your walk of faith, please let us know how we can help you while together we stand.